Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. So today, we're going to be looking at this interview that you sent us
Okay.
with J.D. Vance, the Republican vice presidential nominee.
All right.
Covers a lot of ground
Yeah.
from his life on the campaign trail to his thoughts on some pretty controversial topics. We'll try to get a feel for what a Trump-Vance administration might have in store for us.
Yeah.
What's your initial take on this interview?
Well, the first thing that strikes me is how Vance's personal story really intertwines with his political views. It's not just about policy positions. It's about how his experiences, especially his upbringing in Middletown, Ohio, have shaped his worldview.
You're right. That comes through loud and clear. He talks about the struggles of his community, the loss of manufacturing jobs, the opioid crisis, the feeling that the American dream is slipping away for many. It's personal for him. And I think that resonates with a lot of people.
Exactly. And it allows him to connect with voters who feel like they've been left behind by the system. He's not just talking about abstract economic indicators. He's talking about real people and real communities that are struggling.
He also dives into how his life has changed since becoming a senator, and now the VP nominee, the constant public scrutiny, the impact on his family life.
Yeah.
It's a different world. He even shares some anecdotes about his kids' reactions to having a Secret Service detail. It's a reminder that these political figures are also real people with families.
Yeah, those anecdotes are interesting. But what's more significant is how Vance frames these challenges. He seems to embrace the sacrifices, viewing them as part of a larger mission. He's not complaining. He's almost relishing the fight.
It speaks to a certain resilience, wouldn't you say?
Sure.
A willingness to endure hardship for a cause he believes in.
Yeah.
And that brings us to his relationship with Trump.
Yeah.
How would you characterize their dynamic based on this interview?
It's a complex dynamic, to be sure. There's a clear sense of respect and admiration, but also a subtle undercurrent of tension. Vance seems to be navigating a delicate balance, supporting Trump while also asserting his own independence.
I noticed that too. He's careful to highlight areas where he agrees with Trump, particularly on issues like immigration and trade. But he also hints at disagreements, especially when it comes to foreign policy. He even recounts a story about pushing back against Trump's advisors on a particular issue.
It's a fine line to walk. He needs to maintain his credibility with Trump's base, but he also needs to establish himself as a distinct figure with his own ideas. It'll be interesting to see how this dynamic evolves if they win the election.
Speaking of the election, Vance seems pretty confident about their chances, but he also acknowledges the challenges ahead. He stresses the importance of voter turnout, particularly among working-class voters, who he believes have been disillusioned by both parties.
He's tapping into a sense of alienation and frustration that's widespread across the country. People feel like the system is rigged against them, and they're looking for someone who will fight for their interests.
And Vance positions himself as that fighter. He's the outsider, the voice of the forgotten man, the one who's not afraid to challenge the establishment. It's a powerful message, especially in the current political climate.
It's a message that clearly resonates with a segment of the electorate. The question is whether it's enough to win a national election.
Let's dive into some of the specific issues Vance addresses in this interview.
Yeah.
He really goes after what he calls woke ideology, particularly when it comes to transgender issues. He frames gender transition for minors as experimentation and expresses concerns about the influence of pharmaceutical companies.
This framing is clearly designed to tap into a sense of anxiety and fear among parents. It plays on concerns about social change and the perceived erosion of traditional values. It's a potent message, but is also deeply divisive.
It's definitely one of the most controversial aspects of his platform. He doesn't shy away from the controversy, though. He seems to relish the opportunity to challenge what he sees as the prevailing orthodoxy.
It's part of his broader strategy of positioning himself as a disruptor, a truth teller who's not afraid to speak uncomfortable truths.
He also talks about the cult-like nature of woke ideology, arguing that it's intolerant of dissent and demands complete conformity. This connects back to his concerns about censorship and the suppression of free speech, which we'll get into later.
It's interesting how he connects these seemingly disparate issues, transgender rights, free speech, cultural change, into a cohesive narrative about a society that he believes is heading down a dangerous path.
He's painting a picture of a society that's lost its way, that's embracing radical ideas that threaten the fabric of American life. It's a bleak assessment, but it's one that clearly resonates with a segment of the population.
It's a message that taps into a sense of nostalgia for a simpler time, a time when traditional values were respected and social norms were clear. Whether that's an accurate portrayal of the past is debatable, but it's a powerful narrative nonetheless.
And it's a narrative that Vance uses to justify his call for a return to more traditional values, a restoration of what he sees as the true American spirit.
It's a call that's likely to resonate with those who feel like they've lost their voice in the current cultural climate, those who feel like their values are under attack.
And it's a call that's sure to generate intense debate and controversy as the campaign heats up.
That's for sure. Let's move on to another hot-button issue that Vance addresses: environmentalism. He seems skeptical of the focus on carbon footprint as the primary environmental concern, arguing that it distracts from other important issues, like obesity rates and children's lack of outdoor time.
He even uses the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment as an example of this disparity in attention. Remember, that was a major chemical spill that caused a lot of environmental damage and health concerns.
Right. And Vance argues that this real-world environmental disaster received far less attention than the abstract concept of carbon footprint. He sees this as evidence of a misplaced focus within the environmental movement.
He even suggests that this focus on carbon footprint is part of a broader agenda to control people's lives and limit individual freedom.
It's a pretty provocative claim. He seems to be framing environmentalism as a threat to individual liberty, which is a pretty stark contrast to how most environmentalists view their work.
It definitely puts him at odds with a large segment of the population that's concerned about climate change and the environment. But it also aligns him with those who are skeptical of government intervention and wary of what they see as environmental extremism.
It'll be interesting to see how this stance plays out with voters, especially younger voters who are increasingly concerned about climate change.
It's definitely a gamble, but it's a gamble that Vance seems willing to take. It's part of his broader strategy of appealing to those who feel like they're being ignored or silenced by the mainstream.
It's a strategy that could pay off, but it also carries significant risks.
We're going to delve into Vance's thoughts on big tech, censorship, and the role of the media in shaping public discourse next time.
All right. Host speaker. Vance is really fired up about big tech and censorship, calling it a threat to free speech and open dialogue. It's definitely a recurring theme in this interview. His deep suspicion of concentrated power, whether it's in government, the media, or Silicon Valley.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back, does he? He brings up the Hunter Biden laptop controversy, claiming big tech actively suppressed that story to protect Joe Biden's campaign. He even cites Mark Zuckerberg's admission on the Joe Rogan podcast about the FBI's influence regarding the laptop. It all feeds into this narrative of powerful institutions working together to silence dissenting voices.
And he positions Elon Musk as a sort of champion in this fight, praising his takeover of Twitter as a win for free speech. Do you think Vance is tapping into a real concern here, or is it more about playing to a specific audience?
I think there's a genuine concern among many people, especially on the right, about censorship and the power of big tech to control the flow of information. Whether it's shadow banning, deplatforming, or algorithms that prioritize certain viewpoints, it's a complicated issue with real implications for how we access and share information.
It's interesting how Vance connects this to his critique of the media. He argues that mainstream media outlets are often complicit in this censorship, either by ignoring certain stories or by framing them in a way that reinforces the prevailing narrative.
Give some pretty specific examples, like the way the media covered the comedian's joke at the Trump rally versus how they handled Biden calling Trump supporters garbage. He also points to the edited Kamala Harris interview where her answers seem to be carefully crafted to avoid any real scrutiny. It feels like he's building a case for a deliberate bias against conservative viewpoints.
And he contrasts this with the constant scrutiny applied to Trump, arguing that even the smallest misstep or gaffe was amplified and dissected by the media. It feeds into this sense of a double standard, a feeling that the rules are different for different political groups.
He even goes so far as to claim there's a disparity in the scrutiny applied to Trump versus Kamala Harris in terms of their public schedules. He suggests Harris has a lighter workload and avoids engaging with tough questions, while he and Trump are constantly in the public eye, facing a barrage of questions from the media.
It's a bold claim, but it does raise the question of how much access the media has to different political figures and whether there's a conscious effort to protect certain individuals from scrutiny.
He also drops a potentially explosive allegation about Kamala Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff. He claims there's an accusation of assault against Emhoff that the media has largely ignored. While Vance acknowledges the allegation may not be true, he questions why it hasn't been investigated.
This accusation, even if unsubstantiated, plays into a broader theme of distrust towards institutions and a feeling that certain individuals are shielded from accountability because of their political connections. It's a powerful narrative, even if it's difficult to prove.
Vance doesn't just complain about the media. He also offers some suggestions for improvement. He argues that Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, could foster more balanced journalism by empowering conservative and independent voices within the paper.
It's an interesting idea, but it would require a significant shift in the culture of the Washington Post, which has a long history of leaning left. It would also require Bezos to be willing to challenge the prevailing ideology within his own organization, which is no small feat.
Vance also points out the sheer difference in reach between left-leaning and right-leaning media outlets. He acknowledges Fox News' dominance on the right, but argues it's still dwarfed by the combined audience of the major networks, which he sees as largely biased against conservative viewpoints.
This argument speaks to a structural imbalance in the media landscape that Vance sees as problematic. It also highlights the challenges of reaching a broader audience with conservative viewpoints when the dominant media channels are perceived as hostile.
He even critiques Fox News for not being truly balanced, but suggests they're still more fair in their coverage than networks like NBC. He points to Bret Baier's interviews with both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump as examples of more balanced journalism,
Huh.
arguing that Baier's approach of asking tough but fair questions of both candidates is a model others should emulate.
It's an interesting observation that highlights the importance of journalistic style and approach in shaping the perception of fairness and objectivity.
Vance then argues that the media's often hostile treatment of Trump, combined with their softer approach to Harris, has actually energized Trump's base. He suggests this perceived bias creates a siege mentality, solidifying the belief that the system is rigged against them.
It's a fascinating psychological dynamic. If you constantly feel attacked or misrepresented, it can actually strengthen your resolve and deepen your commitment to your beliefs. It can create a sense of us versus them that fuels political polarization.
And Vance argues that this siege mentality is further intensified by the numerous legal battles Trump has faced, which he views as politically motivated and reminiscent of a banana republic. He contrasts this with Trump's decision not to prosecute Hillary Clinton, despite the FBI's findings that she committed felonies, suggesting Trump prioritized national unity over political retribution.
This framing paints Trump as a victim of a politically motivated witch hunt, which resonates deeply with his supporters. It also allows Vance to contrast Trump's supposed magnanimity with the perceived vindictiveness of the current administration.
He directly addresses those who might be concerned about a Trump administration cracking down on dissent, arguing that Trump has never advocated for arresting or censoring his political opponents. He then pivots to what he sees as Kamala Harris's more authoritarian tendencies, pointing to her role in prosecuting Steve Bannon for contempt of Congress, while she herself defied subpoenas without facing consequences.
It's a powerful accusation of hypocrisy and double standards, which is likely to resonate with those who already view Harris with suspicion. It also plays into the broader theme of distrust towards institutions and the belief that those in power are not held accountable to the same rules as everyone else.
Vance argues that the lack of consequences for Harris's actions, coupled with her willingness to use the power of government to target political opponents, raises serious concerns about her fitness for office. He suggests those worried about censorship and the erosion of democratic norms should be especially wary of a Harris presidency.
This line of argument is clearly designed to scare voters away from Harris and towards Trump. It taps into deep-seated anxieties about government overreach and the potential for abuse of power, especially when it comes to suppressing dissent.
He goes even further, claiming that Harris's Department of Justice is suing to keep illegal voters on the voter rolls, which feeds into concerns about election integrity and potential voter fraud.
This accusation, if true, is incredibly serious and could have major implications for the upcoming election. It plays into the narrative that the Democrats are willing to do whatever it takes to win, even if it means bending or breaking the rules.
Vance then shifts gears a bit, talking about an issue that transcends partisan lines: the need for more research and access to psychedelic therapy for veterans and those struggling with trauma.
This is an interesting departure from the highly charged political topics he's been discussing. It suggests a more compassionate side to Vance, a willingness to consider alternative approaches to challenging issues like mental health and trauma.
He argues that current restrictions on psychedelic therapy are unnecessarily limiting access to potentially life-changing treatments. He expresses frustration with the lack of progress on this issue, suggesting bureaucratic inertia and outdated thinking are preventing the exploration of promising avenues for healing and recovery.
It's a sentiment that's shared by many who believe in the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, but are frustrated by the slow pace of change within the medical and regulatory systems.
And he connects this to his critique of a society that's become overly reliant on pharmaceutical interventions. He argues we need to explore alternative approaches that address the root causes of suffering, not just mask the symptoms. He criticizes those who advocate for legalizing marijuana while opposing research into the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, accusing them of being more interested in political point scoring than finding genuine solutions.
This is a sharp critique that highlights the inconsistencies and hypocrisies within the current political landscape. It also taps into a growing disillusionment with the status quo and a desire for more authentic and effective solutions to complex problems. He specifically highlights the potential of psychedelic therapy to help veterans heal from the trauma of war, arguing that we owe it to those who served our country to explore every avenue for treatment and recovery. He points out that many veterans are forced to seek treatment in other countries or resort to illegal means because of restrictions in the United States.
This appeal to our sense of duty and compassion towards veterans is a powerful argument that transcends partisan divides. It also highlights the absurdity of a system that denies access to potentially life-saving treatments while driving people to seek solutions outside the law.
Vance argues it's time to end the stigma surrounding psychedelic therapy and invest in the research needed to unlock its full potential. He envisions a future where psychedelic therapy is integrated into mainstream healthcare, providing a safe and effective alternative to traditional treatments that often fall short. This vision of a more compassionate and holistic approach to mental health care is likely to resonate with those who are seeking solutions beyond the confines of the current system.
And he ties this back to his earlier critique of pharmaceutical companies, suggesting their influence has stifled innovation and prevented the development of alternative treatments that could threaten their profits.
This accusation of corporate greed impeding progress on vital issues speaks to a broader skepticism towards the role of big business in shaping public policy.
He argues we need to prioritize people over profits and be willing to challenge the status quo when it comes to healthcare, even if it means upsetting powerful interests. And he points to the opioid crisis as a prime example of how corporate greed can have devastating consequences, arguing that the pharmaceutical industry's relentless pursuit of profits led to widespread addiction and suffering.
This accusation of corporate malfeasance underscores the need for greater accountability and oversight when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry. It also taps into a deep-seated anger and resentment towards corporations that are seen as prioritizing profits over the well-being of individuals and communities.
He suggests we need stronger regulations, tougher penalties for wrongdoing, and a renewed focus on ethical practices within the healthcare industry. And he argues we need to be more proactive in addressing the root causes of addiction and trauma rather than simply reacting to the symptoms.
This emphasis on prevention and early intervention aligns with a growing movement that seeks to address the social and economic factors that contribute to mental health challenges. It also suggests a more holistic and nuanced understanding of complex problems like addiction and trauma.
He suggests investing in early childhood education, creating more opportunities for economic mobility, and strengthening community support systems could go a long way in preventing addiction and trauma before they take root.
This is a crucial point. Addressing the underlying causes of these issues requires a comprehensive approach that goes beyond simply treating the symptoms. It requires a commitment to creating a more just and equitable society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Vance also highlights the need for greater access to mental health care services, particularly in rural and underserved communities. He argues we need to invest in training more mental health professionals, expand telehealth services, and remove barriers to treatment, such as high costs and long wait times.
This is a critical issue that often gets overlooked in discussions about mental health. Access to quality care is essential, but it's often unevenly distributed, with those in rural and underserved communities facing significant challenges.
He also emphasizes the importance of reducing the stigma surrounding mental illness, arguing we need to create a culture where people feel comfortable seeking help without fear of judgment or discrimination. He suggests we need to educate the public about mental illness, promote positive portrayals of mental health in the media, and create more supportive environments in schools, workplaces, and communities.
This is a crucial point. Stigma is a major barrier to seeking help for mental health issues. By creating a more open and accepting culture, we can encourage people to reach out for support when they need it.
And he ties this back to his earlier comments about the importance of strong families and communities, arguing that they play a vital role in supporting mental health and well-being. He suggests we need to invest in programs that strengthen families, build community resilience, and create more opportunities for social interaction and belonging.
This is a holistic and insightful approach to fostering mental well-being, recognizing that individual health is interconnected with the health of our communities, and social fabric is essential. Building strong, supportive communities can have a profound impact on mental health.
He envisions a future where mental health is no longer a taboo subject, but rather an integral part of our overall well-being, where people feel empowered to seek help when they need it and receive the support they deserve.
It's a hopeful and inspiring vision, one that recognizes the importance of prioritizing mental health and well-being alongside physical health.
Now let's shift back to the political arena and explore Vance's views on foreign policy, particularly his stance on the war in Ukraine.
Hmm.
He's quite critical of U.S. involvement, calling it insane and advocating for a more peaceful resolution. He seems to be advocating for, like, de-escalation and a negotiated settlement,
Right.
rather than continuing to pour weapons and money into the conflict.
It's a stance that aligns with a growing sentiment, particularly among those who feel the U.S. has been too quick to intervene militarily in recent decades. There's a sense of wariness about becoming entangled in foreign conflicts, especially one as complex and potentially dangerous as the situation in Ukraine.
He even shares an anecdote from the Munich Security Conference, where he found himself the lone voice, questioning continued U.S. support for Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
He was on a panel with the leader of the German Green Party, a staunch supporter of Ukraine, and he realized their positions were almost a complete reversal
Yeah.
of what one might expect.
That's a really interesting observation. It speaks to how political alignments can shift when it comes to foreign policy, with traditional left-right distinctions becoming blurred when national interests and global power dynamics come into play.
He actually argues that the German Green Party's stance on Ukraine is inadvertently benefiting Russia, particularly their push to shut down nuclear and coal power plants, making Germany more reliant on Russian natural gas. He even suggests the German Green Party might be unknowingly influenced by Russian propaganda.
That's a pretty bold claim, suggesting a level of foreign interference that's difficult to prove. But it does highlight the complexities of international relations and the potential for hidden agendas to influence seemingly domestic issues.
Vance seems to be urging for a more cautious and pragmatic approach to foreign policy, one that carefully considers the potential risks and unintended consequences of intervention. He sees the current approach as reckless and potentially disastrous.
It's a perspective that's likely to resonate with those who are skeptical of military intervention and wary of the influence of the military-industrial complex.
And of course, he ties this back to his critique of the media, arguing that their framing of the Ukraine conflict has stifled open debate and prevented a full airing of alternative perspectives.
This reinforces his broader argument that the media often acts as a gatekeeper, shaping the narrative and excluding viewpoints that challenge the prevailing orthodoxy.
What's really fascinating is how he connects this skepticism about the Ukraine war to his concerns about corporate power and influence. He argues that the same forces pushing for escalation in Ukraine, the military-industrial complex, intelligence agencies, and the media, are the ones who benefit from the status quo.
This suggests a belief in a kind of deep state, a network of powerful institutions that operate behind the scenes to advance their own interests, regardless of the will of the people. It's a perspective that's often dismissed as conspiratorial, but it clearly resonates with a segment of the population.
He argues that those who question this narrative are often marginalized and silenced, labeled as conspiracy theorists or Russian propagandists.
This speaks to a broader concern about the suppression of dissent and the narrowing of acceptable discourse. It's a concern that's shared by people across the political spectrum, even if they disagree on the specifics.
Vance seems to be calling for a more open and honest conversation about the Ukraine conflict, one that acknowledges the complexities and considers a wider range of perspectives.
It's a call for greater nuance and critical thinking in our approach to foreign policy, which is something we could all benefit from.
As we wrap up, it's clear that J.D. Vance is a complex and controversial figure. He's a sharp critic of the status quo, a fierce advocate for his beliefs, and a skilled communicator who knows how to tap into the anxieties and aspirations of a particular segment of the electorate.
His worldview is informed by his personal experiences, his deep suspicion of concentrated power, and his belief in the need for radical change. Whether you agree with him or not, he's a force to be reckoned with in American politics.
This deep dive into J.D. Vance's interview has been illuminating. It's given us a glimpse into the mind of a potential future leader and the challenges facing our country.
It's also raised some important questions about the role of media, the influence of corporate power, and the future of American democracy.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of J.D. Vance. Remember, knowledge is power, and we encourage you to continue exploring these issues and forming your own conclusions. What will you deep dive into next?